Welcome back to the Convo Couch, my herbivores. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Johnny Sue is still spinning on the ones and twos. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a great guest with you today. For you today, I should say. It's interesting. This is a guest we need at this time. His name is Aric, A-R-I-C, Mcbay. He's an activist. He is also an author and an organic farmer. He lives near Kingston, Ontario, the prison capital of Canada. He's active in prison justice campaigns, as well as other social and ecological justice issues. Aric, thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Was that a good bio, or did I pick an old one? Is there anything you want to change about that? And why don't you just start off the show telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do?
Sure, that was great. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm an author and an organizer and an organic farmer. So on our farm just east of Kingston, we grow vegetables for about 250 households in the surrounding area. But a lot of my time is spent in different kinds of activism and organizing. So prison issues are really critical and I think are becoming more and more important. And I think as the political context in many countries veers toward the authoritarian, we see how prison issues overlap with all other political movements, right? Because eventually that's what those in power try to do to crack down, is to charge people, to put people in prison. And of course, climate justice is another issue that I am very concerned about and spend a lot of time working and writing on. And again, the climate emergency affects all of us and really affects the future of all of our movements.
Johnny?
Yeah. So Aric, I'm Jonny Tsunami. I'm on the ones and twos. I'm running the whole show and making sure everybody looks beautiful. A fan reached out to us to get you on the show after watching our Dr. Cornel West interview, and particularly the question in that interview where we ask, is revolutionary change even possible without violence? Let's just watch a quick clip of that.
Is revolutionary change even possible without violence? And that's a hefty question because we could all agree or disagree on that. But
no, indeed. Well, I tell you, all come ready though, don't you?
Oh yeah,
you all well prepared, fortified for this dialogue. Well, one is that one has to take a stand one way or another in terms of the issues of violence and so forth.
Yeah.
That as a revolutionary Christian, I don't agree with my dear brother Martin Luther King Jr. or my dear brother Desmond Tutu, who are absolute pacifists. I'm not an absolute pacifist at all. I believe in exploring all nonviolent options and alternatives. But when those alternatives are still unable to protect the vulnerable, then there's justification of certain kinds of violence and war.
So I just wanted to play a little bit of that. Your fan that reached out, Davina, said that Aric's made it clear that these peaceful, nonviolent marches alone are not going to cut it. I agree. So how do you build an effective resistance movement?
Well, I think for me, the answer comes from history. You know, the question of violence and nonviolence, the question of what tactics work. Well, that's not a theoretical question. We can look at many different movements in the United States and around the world to see what was required, to see what tactics actually worked. And I think, Nelson Mandela put it very well when he said it's the oppressor who determines the tactics that are required, not the oppressed. So if those in power are willing to yield to gentler tactics, are actually willing to listen to people, then you can have a much gentler system of change. You can have a much more nonviolent approach to change. I think the more authoritarian those in power become, the more challenging, if not impossible, real change becomes without the ability for people to generate true political force. And force doesn't have to be violence, right? I mean, there are lots of ways for a movement to develop political force. Strikes are a way of developing political force. Shutting down industrial infrastructure, railways, highways. These are all ways of generating force. And I think that's really the big difference between different kinds of movements and the difference between effective movements and ineffective movements. And it's not necessarily about whether they're violent or not. It's about whether or not they can generate political force. whether they're willing to be disruptive and take the risks that entails. I think, radical movements in the history of the United States and around the world, they want deep change and they're willing to use the tactics that are required. When we look at more kind of liberal movements, those are often movements that are led by people who have a lot more privilege, who are actually pretty comfortable with the situation as it is, with the system as it is, and they're not willing to take those risks, to go out and create force. We often see that political force is generated most effectively when people use a lot of different tactics at the same time. The civil rights movement was a great example, right? You had people who were using nonviolence very explicitly in civil rights sit-ins, this sort of thing. But we often forget that those movements also relied on groups like the Deacons for Defense, an armed self-defense group of Black veterans, founded by Black veterans, which was created before the Black Panthers, and which would go to civil rights sit-ins in the South, organized by the NAACP, by CORE, by other groups, and essentially guard it with guns to prevent the KKK or the police or white supremacist vigilantes from either side from attacking those people. So that diversity of tactics we see, I think, is really crucial to the success of all kinds of movements.
And going off of that, you mentioned the civil rights movement, and right now we're having a resurgence of protests. That as a result of the killing, a death of George Floyd. What are your thoughts on these protests? I mean, they have been focused on defunding the police and Black lives, but we've also started seeing a shift on economics. Obviously, we can't help ourselves. It's a pandemic. They're denying healthcare. We are also on the brink of economic collapse. People are going to get evicted from their homes. Half of America is unemployed. So have you been to any protest, and what do you see that could potentially be lacking? In other words, where are there situations where we could actually improve on how these protests are being conducted?
Sure. So I regularly participate in different racial justice protests and have for a long time. I think that I'm very excited about the strength that we see in this racial justice movement and Black Lives Matter right now. I think it's really exciting for a lot of different reasons. And one of which is that they have focused on defunding the police, which I think is a genuinely radical goal. I think a lot of the dialogue around police reform has focused on things like body cams, which is really kind of a superficial approach that doesn't address the root problems. It doesn't address white supremacy. It doesn't address the fact that police seem to turn their cameras off or have malfunctions whenever, they're in a situation where body cams would be required. So I think that radical goal is really important because it also means that we've kind of aimed further ahead. We've aimed higher. So if those in power try to compromise, whether that's out of a genuine desire for change or out of a desire to co-opt or undercut the movement, then those compromises are going to be bigger than what we would have gotten otherwise. I also think I've been really glad to see the vigor and the willingness to use disruption in these movements, in this movement right now. Because if you look at something just like a protest or a polite march that doesn't cause disruption, the sort of thing where, organizers call the police in advance to say, here's our route and here's where we're going to be and we're not going to cause any trouble, that does not create much change because it doesn't disrupt the status quo. It doesn't create a political cost or an economic cost for those in power. And that's what we see in movements that are effective, right? They become impossible to ignore and they become very expensive, frankly, for the status quo. I think in general, we've seen more and more direct action in these movements. And I think that's absolutely critical. I think, movements can use lots of different tactics, but if they're missing direct action, they're probably not going to achieve very much. And so the willingness to get out there persistently in the streets, again and again, is really important, and the refusal to back down. And I think another aspect that's really critical is that there's been so much genuine movement building going on for a long time. I think right now in the context of COVID and high profile police murders, we've seen this kind of upsurgence that's partly a response to crisis, a response to visible emergency. But I think the reason as well that we're seeing this level of success is because there have been activists in Black Lives Matter and many different organizations who've been working really tirelessly for years to build the strength of their communities, to build relationships, to build an intersectional approach. And that's absolutely important. So we really need those two things. We need diverse tactics that include direct action. One of the stories I tell in my book, Full Spectrum Resistance, is about Stonewall. And Stonewall, of course, is famous for being essentially a series of riots that kicked off the modern queer rights movement, the gay liberation movement. And that was effective in part because of their refusal to abide by business as usual. But what some people don't realize is that there were a number of riots in response to police raids in other cities, in other locations in the years before Stonewall, but none of them kind of kick-started that same movement. And part of the reason was that in the context of New York, there was such a strong LGBTQ movement, a strong community, that they could combine kind of that community with direct action and produce a very powerful movement. I think we're seeing that same combination now. So I don't want to discount, the importance of baseline organizing, the importance of people having those conversations with others over a long period of time and building organizations.
Did you think there was any area in particular where something is lacking? I mean, I love the fact that you said, what kind of protest is it if you give them the information where you're going, the route you're going? And that's not a protest. And Fam over here, she's always like, what are they doing? Like, I got to show these people how to protest. They got to be disruptors. But aside from that, what else is lacking within these protests that you think they can improve on? Just to be a little bit critical.
It seems a little disorganized in a lot of ways, and that's always the battle, right? Decentralization versus too much centralization would lead to more co-option. So can you speak a little bit on that?
Sure. I think, movements that are really effective tend to have a mix of kind of bigger organizations that are more coordinated, as well as a lot of smaller groups that are maybe not as centrally organized, but that can be more autonomous, that can be more creative, more inventive. And I think when we see those groups working together, we have a really big impact. In the context that you're talking about, this is the maybe the protest vernacular of the last 20 or 30 years, is that we see a lot of people showing up kind of to the same place where the police are already going to be, and where we don't necessarily have the element of surprise, right? And that's where we can, again, learn from other movements in history. There's a whole chapter in my book, Full Spectrum Resistance, about tactics and about the tactics that movements can use to be more successful. Surprise is really critical. Surprise is one of the things that we absolutely need to use. So when movements show up, or when groups show up to disrupt places where they're not expected, where there aren't already hundreds of riot police, they can get a lot of disruption accomplished that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. Coordination between different locations and different cities is also really valuable, or coordination in different places in the same city. And as well, going about it to look at economic costs, right? Because that's one of the challenges that I think on the left, very often in Canada and the US, going after trying to score kind of political points, so trying to cost the Republicans, their status. And the Republicans don't care what people on the left think. The Republicans don't care what Black people think. The Republicans don't care what poor people think. But they will respond to things that cost them money or cost them power. I think a great example of a really effective movement in this year, actually, that used a lot of these things that we're talking about, has been the Wet'suwet'en struggle in Canada. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with on the West Coast. There's a community that's been trying to keep pipelines out for many years. And the police kind of moved in with a militarized force this spring. And there was a huge mobilization across the country in solidarity. So Mohawks near me started blocking railroad lines. And within a few days, almost the entire Canadian rail network had been shut down by people blocking rail lines all over the country. There was almost no freight moving across the entire country for weeks. People shut down bridges, shut down highways. It was incredibly expensive and incredibly impactful. You can't ignore something like that. And so I think that's something that racial justice movements should look into and should consider more, is how can we create these large scale, on a system level, these economic impacts that will be really expensive, that it's not just about shutting down a city downtown, but how can we really make it expensive and impossible to ignore?
Well, you also talked about just recently about how these organizations, these protests, should turn into like large militant organizations. Two questions about that. And as far as the big groups and the small groups. Number one, in today's day, won't that be a little bit dangerous with the weaponry the United States? In other words, I'm feared that if people show up with guns to protect protesters, they'll drone our ass. And secondly, what about if these large groups and these little groups haven't really found a way to work together? They kind of distance from themselves. I see some of the smaller groups can be very critical of some of the bigger groups, and some of the bigger groups want to do their own thing in a peaceful manner and not let these other groups come in. How do we get them to join together to really put fear into the elite's eyes?
Great questions. So a couple of things. When I use the term militancy, I don't just mean people who are armed. I use the term militancy to mean anyone who wants to fight, essentially, who thinks that the solution to the problem includes fighting the status quo or fighting those in power. And so, we don't have to do exactly the same thing that people did in the civil rights movement. We shouldn't just kind of mimic groups like the Deacons for Defense, but we should kind of understand the underlying principles. And I think in the modern context, one of the things that makes people safe is grassroots media, right? Like for people to be there with cameras so that the police are less able to be violent toward protesters or to be violent toward the press. So I think that's really crucial. I think that when I look at militants now, people who are blocking a railroad track, that would be a great example of kind of militancy in the political context. Your question about coordination is really important. And that's one of the reasons that I have a lot of hesitation about using Facebook. I think, Facebook is a great way to mobilize people and connect with people. But I think systems like Facebook make it difficult for us to coordinate effectively, because essentially everything that happens on Facebook could be accessed by the police, could be accessed by law enforcement, right? So it's really important to do what movements through history have done and build our own systems of communication to make relationships with people that we can trust, both in our own cities, in our own areas, and across the country and internationally. And I think that relationship building is really important, and it can kind of get ignored sometimes because it's not very dramatic, right? If there's a movie about the 1999 Seattle protests, there will be lots of scenes of tear gas and riot cops and people, running down the streets. There are not a lot of scenes with people who have spent years, getting to know each other and getting to trust each other and building a common analysis and having movie nights where they look at other movements and see what they did right and see what they did wrong and learn from it. So I think that's really critical. And I think that's a big part of the answer to your question, is that we have to build a genuine culture of resistance. And a lot of that work happens between these moments of kind of really dramatic upheaval that happen every few years, right? It's this slow, quiet work that makes us much more effective when the next opportunity arises. And I do think there's often a gendered element to how that's portrayed in the media or pop culture and how that happens. In our culture, it's often women who are doing that work, who are doing kind of the social community building work. And it's often men who are shown, at least, in kind of this more militant role. And so I think getting a little bit more balance in the stories that we tell about movements and in the kinds of work that we prioritize will make our movements a lot more effective, able to coordinate and all of these things when there is a crisis.
And as far as the groups working the small and the big together, like, how can we get them to make amends with each other? I mean, because if we see some of these small groups join with some of these big groups, we'll get that protest with all those people where the elites will be shitting their pants. Right now, we have a bunch of like fragmented groups all around, and a couple big groups that, you know, kind of get knocked for their kind of pacifist kind of mentality of like, okay, we're done with the protest, everybody go home at this time, and bloop. I mean, what do we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one approach is for people who are radicals to essentially take the lead in that case. You know, we don't have to. I think part of the challenge is that you know, young anarchists, for example, might look at a situation like that and say, well, the leaders are always telling people to go home, so we don't want to have leaders. We don't want anyone to take on this role, and it'll just kind of be spontaneous. But I think it's, you know, we can see leaders who are genuinely radical and who listen to other people in a participatory way. So I think for radical groups to take more leadership in that way, to invite people to participate, you know, I've seen situations where that's worked really well. I think for radicals to have kind of blocks, essentially, that not necessarily black blocks, but blocks that are willing to show up at a protest or an event and communicate with other people and say, let's do this. We don't have to do, you know, what this kind of mainstream NGO is telling us to do, to show some leadership. And I think the other critical part of it, and again, this is kind of the movement building perspective, is to make sure to tell more stories about movements that have used radical approaches, that have used militant tactics, because the stories that I was taught in school and the stories that I see in the mass media are really a very sanitized version of movement history, right? Yeah. I mean, they leave things out like the Deacons for Defense. They leave out almost any kind of disruption. And so people show up at a protest for the first time. They don't even really know that's an option. You know, they just think, oh, well, we show up and we listen to that person on the megaphone who tells us to go home when the police say to go home. And, you know, in movements here in my part of Ontario, you know, this has been a long-term struggle around things like prison organizing. About 10 years ago, we had a lengthy campaign trying to keep some agriculture programs open at some local prisons. These were programs where prisoners got to go outside. You know, incarcerated people were telling us that it was really valuable for them to spend time outside, time with animals, and the government tried to shut this down. And there was the whole kind of spectrum of response that you would expect in something like that, right? There were petitions, there was awareness raising, all of that sort of thing, and it didn't work. And there was a turning point when people could have decided, hey, we're all going to go home, or are we going to escalate? And in that case, the movement decided to escalate, decided to use civil disobedience, decided to blockade the prisons to try to keep, you know, cows from being removed, to try to keep equipment from being moved out, all of this stuff. But that happened really fast, which was incredible, but it also made it very hard to build the skills and familiarity among the participants to be flexible. So, you know, there was one of those blockades, and you can see this in a great movie called Till the Cows Come Home. It's a documentary about this. At one of those blockades, one of the organizers thought that they had to deal with the police, and so told people to go home. And kind of dismantled the blockade. And people listened because they didn't have their own affinity groups. They didn't have other kind of knots or clusters within that movement that they could trust. And we'd encouraged people to build those. But, you know, before the blockades happened, before they were facing off with the police, they didn't understand why they needed to do that. They didn't understand why that was important. And so that, building affinity groups, building this kind of capacity for autonomy, that's something that takes a long time potentially, and that people have to practice, have to develop. It's a skill that we have to train in, like many other things.
Jonny. Oh, it was me.
Number 5, Judy.
Okay. Well, so I've heard you criticize capitalism. The GDP has dropped about 33% in what's called the worst GDP report ever this year. Are we on the precipice of economic collapse? What are you yourself doing to prepare for that? And what should we be doing? Because it seems like we're at the tipping point.
Sure. So it's hard to tell if we're on the edge of economic collapse because, the GDP is a bit of a shell game, right? I mean, it measures some things that really matter to rich people, but it ignores a huge number of things. I mean, it ignores the health and well-being of the majority of people. It ignores the health and well-being of the planet. So it's completely possible that the economy could continue to get worse for regular people, and the stock market could keep going up, right? I mean, the GDP could recover. We've seen that before. So for me, I think, it's about building resilience so that we can respond to whatever is going on. Part of the reason that I am a farmer as a climate justice activist, because I wanted to learn the skills that were necessary to cooperate with the land, essentially, to live in a place and provide food in a way that doesn't depend on capitalism, that doesn't depend on international trade. So for me, building that community has been really critical, and it is about community. I don't like using the term self-sufficiency because no individual can do what is necessary to kind of sustain themselves. We really need communities where people take care of each other, and where we have a lot of different skills. So I do think that in the long term, in the next few decades, with climate chaos on the horizon, it is really important for people to get connected with ways of growing food, or to learn to grow food, to kind of go to look at some of the basic skills like mending and trades and all of these things that we would need without capitalism, without this centralized economy. But I think in the short term, one of the things that everyone can focus on is just taking care of each other. Building that community resilience with the people around us, I think, is really critical.
Are you suggesting being a vegan? Because we are now. We love it. We love it. So, I mean, like, really, but the whole, you talk about the economics that are plugged in. When you can grow your own food, your own sustainability, it's so important rather than getting plugged into the system, which says, oh, you have to buy food from these people, whatnot, all the time, and depend upon them. But you also state that every issue on the table is directly connected to climate change, right? Can you give us a little synopsis into that theory?
Sure. So, we often think when we look at the economy, or when the news reports on the economy, it's like, well, here's the economy. The economy is everything. And then people are inside of that. And then the environment is inside of that in the middle. It's kind of, the environment is whatever just affects humans directly. But really, it's the other way around, right? I mean, we all live on Earth. We all depend on the biosphere. And then humans are within that. And then the economy is just kind of part of our human interactions. So everything that we do, from the food that we eat every day, the air that we breathe, depends on nature, depends on ecology. And climate change, the climate emergency, is fundamentally threatening that. We're looking at a situation in the next 50 years where, 15 to 20% of the Earth could be so hot that it's basically uninhabitable. And those people are going to have to move somewhere. We've already seen with the rise of a refugee crisis, which has been sparked in partly by climate change combined with colonialism, that, these refugee movements, this migrant crisis, has really worsened xenophobia in the United States and around the world. People like Trump and many others have used this as an excuse for xenophobia, as an excuse to kind of whip up xenophobia, racism, white supremacy. And so we are already seeing, I think, the early impacts of climate change in our political context. And that is only going to get worse in the years ahead. As food gets more expensive, as we see more extreme weather events like Katrina happening more and more around the world, as conflicts, not just political conflicts, but armed conflicts around the world are exacerbated by climate change. This is really going to overturn a lot of the economic situations that people take for granted, the economic status quo. And none of our movements can achieve their aims if we're not able to stop runaway climate change. We have seen, as part of the refugee crisis, that the impacts are disproportionately on women, right? That women are much more hurt by displacement, that queer people are more hurt by displacement. The effects of climate change are really very intersectional, because they will disproportionately and already disproportionately affect racialized people, poor people, indigenous people. And if we live on a planet where there's basically enough food to go around, then we can solve a lot of our political problems. We can solve a lot of our economic problems because it's a matter of distribution. But if we're in a situation where people can't even grow enough food, where 1 billion people or more can't live where they're living now, it's going to become almost impossible to solve these problems in an equitable way. And I think a lot of people who are kind of maybe in the political center in the Western world, and right now are receptive to the ideas of the left, I think a lot of those people will get into a real fortress mentality, and that overt fascism will seem more and more appealing to those people, that the order brought by authoritarianism will become more appealing. And I think at that point, we could see a huge rollback of the human rights that people have struggled and fought and died for over the last 100 years. And I think, we may already be seeing the early stages of that in the United States and other countries.
So, okay, got it. So what exactly is discussed on your in your book, The Full Spectrum Resistance, tactics wise, and is it an operating procedure for activists to take that and then organize? And I've been seeing a lot of organizers that are new and they're very, very young, and I feel like they need some guidance. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So Full Spectrum Resistance is a book that I wrote that I wish I had as a young activist. So, I've been an organizer for more than 20 years. And so many of the movements that I've worked on, the campaigns that I've worked on, have not won, right? I mean, they've been losing ground. We've seen that in many different places in the climate struggle, in anti-poverty struggles, and many other things. But history is full of movements that have succeeded and that won us many of the rights that we have now and that some people take for granted. So I wanted to do a few things with Full Spectrum Resistance. One of them was to look at those stories and to tell some of the stories of movements that won, that we don't necessarily hear very much about, that we don't kind of hear in the popular discourse or in pop culture. Examples that have maybe been written out of that history. I wanted to look at those and celebrate them and also learn from them, right? To learn the lessons and the principles that movements that succeeded have been applying for decades. So it's a movement. It's a book that I think would be useful for new activists, to be sure, as a primer, and as a fairly comprehensive, 2-volume history that will ground them a lot of movement principles and give them successful movement examples that they can draw on. But I think it's also something that will be useful for a lot of experienced activists who maybe want to look at things from a different perspective or learn some, I learned about tons of movements that I'd never heard of, despite, having spent decades studying these things. So it's a mix of those stories. It's a mix of kind of theory to help us understand movements and practical checklists. So, for example, there is a checklist in the chapter on tactics about how to plan an action. The things to consider, things that you might want to bring, who you might want to talk to. There are checklists, for example, some of the tools that movements can use to help fight repression or to make themselves and their members safer. There are checklists for recruitment. So things, if you want to grow your group and grow your movement, grow a campaign, what are some of the things that you can do? So it really is a mix of kind of the stories that I hope will get people through, that inspire and sustain us, and also some of the practical stuff that, you know, I go back there all the time if I'm planning an action or an event. I'll go back and just check to make sure I'm not forgetting something that might be important or something that I might want to try.
You know, I think I should get a hold of that book. Watching the first video I saw of you was in Oakland in 2011, and you telling that story, what happened in the 30s. I'm like, geez Louise, why was I never told about this movement before? It's like we don't learn this stuff in school. Our empire education doesn't allow that.
Yes.
And, you know, furthermore, I can't wait to get excited. I think it's going to be a great reference guide, and you look at other, like you said, where did they, and you explain clearly where did they find success? What tactics did they use? And like you said, they can go back and look at it. So I'm looking forward to getting a hold of the book. But when we go to Portland the other day, you know, last week, and it's like a war zone, and we kept on saying it looks like America's brought their imperialism home and the chickens have come to roost. How different, first of all, what are your thoughts about America's foreign policy, and how different are the Democrats than the Republicans in Congress when it comes to that foreign policy?
I mean, it's difficult to summarize, but I think the short answer is that we have not seen a very substantial difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of their foreign policy, right? Mm-hmm. Under Obama, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of drone strikes, an increase in the number of people who were so even though on kind of in a superficial way, we see some differences, they are both corporate, colonial, imperialist parties, essentially. And even though there are people within those parties who are trying to change things, you know, and I think of it really as a ratchet that, you know, the Republicans are in power rather, and they push that ratchet forward. They make things more authoritarian. They, you know, strip away parts of the social safety net. And then the Democrats come in and they don't really reverse things. They don't reverse those changes. They might not make it much worse when they're in power. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But they essentially keep it at that same level. And then when the Republicans come back, they can go back to pushing things forward. And because there's this constantly shifting baseline, people say, oh, the Democrats, at least we have them for a while. But you know, things don't necessarily change in any positive way.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, a lot of people are having this debate right now here in the United States, whether to work within the Democratic Party or to just burn it down in the sense of just leave it, abandon it, and start focusing on outside cadres, building outside parties. We have the Green Party. It's lacking organization, direction, and power, but also it's a catch-22 because people just don't go out there and do it. We have some of our best organizers working inside the Democratic Party when the incrementalism they'll achieve will be so minimal at best, and the outside needs help organizing. On top of that, we should seize the momentum that's going on right now with the protests. And so the question is, what is the iron law of involution, excuse me? And are we seeing that within the progressive movement that is attempting to reform the Democratic Party?
Sure. So the iron law of involution is an observation made by social movement theorists that says basically when a new movement begins, it kind of has two outcomes if it's growing rapidly. Either it succeeds in making material gains, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or it fails in doing that. And if it fails, it tends to turn inward. So it tends to be that people in that movement, instead of focusing on making tangible progress, they focus on attacking other people in that movement and say, oh, you don't have the right political line. You're these other people in the movement. And it really becomes this very harmful kind of toxic environment that ultimately drives people away, right? And you end up with this kind of hardcore of embittered activists. And the opposite of that, the institution means that that a movement can have power within kind of the establishment, but it's given up essentially on its original radical goals. It's given up on profound change, and I think that's an important tension for people who are trying to make some of these decisions that you mentioned. People are trying to figure out, where should I actually put my organizing efforts to have the most impact? And I think if someone is watching this, and trying to make that decision, then you are probably the kind of people who should be organizing outside of the Democratic Party, right? You're the people who should be looking at much more radical, transformative ways of changing things. And I think that's important for another reason. There's another principle at work, which is called radical flanking. And radical flanking is the idea that when a movement has kind of a more extreme wing, or it has a more dramatically committed wing, a wing that has more aspirations, then that radical flank can kind of drag other people along. It drags, you know the term the Overton window, I'm sure?
Yeah.
That, this idea of the Overton window of radical flanking is something that the right wing understands so well. People on the right for decades have been spouting the most horrible, racist, misogynistic garbage, and have succeeded in dragging the whole political spectrum rightward to the point where someone like Trump can become president. And the left in general is really terrified to do that. I think the left is really timid to take any position that might be seen as outside of the mainstream. And that's one of the main reasons that we've been losing for so long. If people are willing to organize in more radical context, in more genuinely transformative organizations, then the Democratic Party will follow along. And I think that's, it's such a missed opportunity. I think that young organizers, especially who have a more radical outlook, a more truly progressive outlook, can have a bigger impact on the Democratic Party by showing the possibilities that exist outside of it. And the successes that you have will make the Democrats catch up. I mean, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago the example of the 1930s. During the Great Depression, the biggest economic crisis before the one that we are experiencing now, that could have gone a lot of different ways. A lot of countries became fascist in that same time period. And the United States brought in many aspects of the social safety net, right? The New Deal. And it didn't bring that in because the Democratic Party, or because, people on the left in the political establishment thought, oh, hey, wouldn't this be great? They did it because communists and socialists and anarchists, genuine radicals outside of the political establishment, were gaining so much ground because those in power were afraid of a genuine revolution. Historian Charles Beard called it the thunder on the left, that there was so much of this thunder, so much disruption happening on the left, that the political establishment had no choice but to follow along and to put in place, a real social safety net. Yeah. And I think often in our current context, we've been missing that thunder on the left, in particular when it comes to the white left. And I think that's something that's very obvious now, is that movements of color have been taking more radical approaches and more intersectional approaches for a long time. And it's the predominant, white middle class left, the upper class left, that's been holding this progress back.
Got a couple super chats? Well, you want to ask a question first, John?
Just want to discuss, out here in LA, there are, there's been a lot of protests, and now we're starting to see a lot of Trump, pro-Trump, anti-protester protests, right? So, to build a movement even greater, and I feel like communication is a great form, right? We need to discuss, because we have more similarities between the lower income working class than we do with all the elites and politicians who are making millions of dollars. So I'm afraid that we're not going to be able to really see a big change because we're not going to be able to break through to those people. Your thoughts on yeah.
Sure. I think one of the most important things for us to do as organizers is to look for victories on a scale that we can achieve, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's been a big challenge for the left in general, as well as for radicals. And I think that's a key part of the iron law of involution, that when you have movements that are genuinely radical, but that don't achieve any victories, it's really hard for them to reach new people and to sustain that momentum. And often people look for changes that are more dramatic than they have the power to achieve in that moment, right? So, for example, if I were to go out as an organizer and say to people, we can't do anything, we can't achieve anything until we've abolished capitalism, then I'm probably not going to get a lot of recruits, right? Because capitalism doesn't feel like it's going to go away right now. Whereas if I go out as many movements are doing right now and say, hey, we can help keep you from getting evicted. We can look at, addressing racial justice in your city and these specific wins, then I think that helps us to gain ground. So that's often the hardest part of building a movement or building a campaign, is identifying the different steps that you can take to achieve. Examples that I talk about in Full Spectrum Resistance as a movement that did that is the temperance movement in the United States, right? The anti-alcohol movement of the early 20th century. And the outcome of prohibition was not great and didn't work, but there's a lot that we can learn from their approach, which they called local gradualism. And essentially what they did was they identified a bunch of specific towns or communities where they thought they could pass local prohibition ordinances. And then they would go and really focus on that. And when they had a win, they would promote that to their supporters. And then they would learn from that. They would get momentum and go up to the state level and eventually go up, to the national level as they gain more and more momentum. I think in our current context, defunding the police is a great example of a really important change that can happen at the local level, that you can see, we can foresee local wins happening in that way. I think another area that has to do more with climate justice is the divestment movement, is getting, unions and universities to stop investing in the fossil fuel industry. And I think that's another area where we can see a lot of local wins. So I think that's, the question that you've asked is really one of the trickiest things for organizers to learn how to do. And it really requires, to get good at that, it requires having a lot of conversations with people you agree with and people you're not sure if you agree with, right? You have to look for those people who are maybe on the edge of being your supporter and hear what they actually think and hear what they understand, so you can identify the things that will move them, both in terms of the way that you're framing your message, in terms of the way that you communicate, and in where you're putting your kind of efforts, the specific changes that you're pushing for on a day-to-day basis. And it also requires that we, do kind of focus our efforts, because again, that's a challenge to organizing on the left. I think, if you're an organizer on the right wing in kind of corporate America, then they can all get together and say, well, whatever makes us more money, we'll just do that. And it's easy to organize around. It's easy to rally people around that. On the left, there are a lot more things that we are concerned about, right? We're concerned about racism and ending white supremacy. We're concerned about, gender equality. We're concerned about class equality, all of these different things that we have to balance. And it requires a lot more skill. It requires a lot more kind of a nuanced approach. And that's one of our challenges. And that's another reason that it takes practice and conversations and really being committed to intersectionality, right? To show up and build relationships with other organizers who are working on causes or campaigns that are different from the one that you mostly focus on.
I was going to say, yeah, you were stating earlier that, it's really important to get these political gains. Fred Hampton Jr. is one of those guys who always says everything is political. No matter what you say, no matter any way you look at any racial issue, social issue, ecological issue, it's all political. Now, if I want to go out there and start a resign campaign, telling Nancy Pelosi to resign, Mayor Garcetti to resign, is that good enough unless we have something positive to push forward? In other words, shouldn't we be looking to push people, independent thinking minds in certain areas and districts for city council and mayor and all those things? I mean, isn't it just a moot point if we maybe stop one thing, but we don't replace the mechanism, which is going to help us moving forward for other progress?
I agree. I think it's really important to have a positive vision to help move people forward. And I think it's really critical, it's critical to motivate people and get people to show up and to participate. But I think it's also critical for our existence in this very challenging time to kind of keep our spirits alive, to keep our spirits going, to be able to show that a better world is possible. And, again, I think that's one of the ways in which our kind of individual connections, our local connections and relationships are really important, because it's those, face-to-face connections, those human relationships that can keep people going through hard times and that can really sustain us. So I think framing things in positive terms is really critical in motivating people and in overcoming, what could be in many ways a very despairing, cynical time.
Super
All
chats?
right. Super chat.
Super chat time. Amers, thank you for the super chat contribution. It is always appreciated on the couch. It says you've been knocking out of the park. Fire. Keep it coming. Heart. Love you, fam. We love you too, Amers. Thank you for all those lovely gifts. I also have a super chat contribution. Let me get to the next one. From Davina Artaby. Thank you, Davina. And thank you for getting us and mentioning Aric. It's been a great interview. You said thank you for having Aric Mcbay on. I'm learning so much from his book. It's the Ultimate Activist Handbook. I think Fam asked about that before. I'm eager to get it because I like the history involved that we don't know about, that actually gives us concrete examples on how to get progress from these protests. And that's something that we're searching for when we are critical at times, when we are questioning. We don't want to tell anybody how to protest. We just want to see this thing get to the next level and see these groups grow. Kate, thank you for the super chat contribution, says, love this guest. We love him too. And then one more super chat contribution from Amers. Once again, I feel like the term radical is used by the mainstream media to scare older people, not to define people fighting for human rights, justice, and equality. Your thoughts there?
Sure. I mean, I use the term radical in its original sense. Latin means, the Latin word radix means root. So a radical is someone who tries to go to the root of a problem, who tries to create root change. And it's true that it's used as a scare term in the media, but I think it's a word that we should reclaim. I think it's a word and a tradition that we should be proud of. And capitalism, that's a word that the media uses to mean freedom. There are lots of words that we can and should redefine. And if we use that word with someone who is confused or scared, then that's an opportunity maybe to share some information with them, to educate them a little bit about history and about why genuinely radical approaches are important.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate the discussion, especially during this time where we're all having debates with each other as to how to proceed and where do we go from here. It's becoming very useful to think about these things as we engage in the protests and deal with the incoming crisis ahead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you were an amazing guest, and we'll see you soon. Would you come back and do it again with us down the road?
I would be happy to come back. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me here, and thank you for all of your great work.
Yes, and we'd love to send you a T-shirt if you can send us a signed copy of your book. That's what I love. I want a signed copy from Aric. Ladies and gentlemen.
Sounds good.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all who are watching on the ROKFIN. We're seeing that platform grow. Hey, if you're on the YouTube and you haven't signed up for the ROKFIN, please do so now. It is free, and if you got a few extra bucks, you can endorse us for $9.99 a month. Remember, they don't censor our words or our monetization, so it really helps us out. And thank you to all our patrons. We got 115 climbing, and we need more. So thank you, and we'll see you soon for Pasta Jardula.
Fiorella.
Johnny Sue on the ones and twos with Aric Mcbay.
Convo out.
Peace.
Bye, guys.